Hi, I'm Jennifer. I'm an AmeriCorps service member here at the McKinney Center in Jonesborough. This is History Corner. This is an initiative of StoryTown, and this is our second episode, so welcome and thank you for watching. Today I would like to tell you about something interesting I stumbled across while doing research for my African American Schools project. One of the predecessors of Booker T. Washington School, the Warner Institute, which happens to be across the street, to me is a really cool intersection of Quakers and civil rights in the United States. And I think it's wonderful that it's here in Jonesborough. So to begin, we'll start with the Quakers. During the Civil War, the Quakers were known to assist the enslaved with escape to freedom, known as the Underground Railroad. So that wasn't just a physical place, it was a network of people. And a lot of that network in the Mid-Atlantic and New England states were the Quakers. They actually had a meeting here in East Tennessee. There are alleged ties to the Underground Railroad in Jefferson City. But the first meeting of the Quakers took place in the late 1700s by the Nolichucky River. And that building actually is still standing today. The Quakers were committed to social justice, and they were very revolutionary for their time. They were appalled by slavery because it was in direct opposition of their moral and natural law. So after the Civil War, after emancipation, they focused their efforts to educating freedmen, because as we know, the enslaved were denied education and promised more rights during the Reconstruction. The Friends established a group called the Freedmen's Association, and there were actually more groups too that the women headed, and then the men headed a separate organization. And those were the Women's Aid Association on behalf of destitute freedmen in the South. And then the Quaker men organized Friends Freedmen's Association of Philadelphia in November of 1863. Well, the Friends Freedmen's Association kind of expanded, and they sent out these sponsored riders to go around the country, especially in the South, to determine where schools were needed for freedmen. One of those riders was Yardley Warner. He was born in Pennsylvania, received Quaker education, studied law, admitted to the bar, decided not to practice law. He wanted to help people get education instead. So he walked from where he was in Pennsylvania, probably close to Philadelphia. It's about 500 miles to Tennessee, and determined that schools were needed in Athens, Tennessee, Rogersville, Tennessee, Maryville, Tennessee, and Jonesborough, Tennessee. And he purchased the Holston Mill Institute and all of the furniture for $3,600. And the premises were given to him on the 1st of January in 1876. But the Warner Institute for the Education of Freedmen opened its doors in September of 1876. Also backing the Friends Freedmen's Association was a bureau enacted by Congress, and that was in 1865. It was known as the Freedmen's Bureau to assist Africans during their transition to emancipation. There was a Union general named Oliver Howard. He was appointed commissioner of that bureau. And it is said that the Congressional Bureau was silently funding the Friends Association for the freedmen. So Howard actually went on to establish Howard University in DC, and then Lincoln Memorial in Harrogate. Meanwhile, in Minnesota, there was a teacher named Julia Bullard Nelson, and she was a well-known women's suffragist, and she outwardly opposed enslavement and racism, so she was quite an activist. She taught in Minnesota. She taught in Connecticut. She was widowed by the age of 26. Her husband was a soldier in the Civil War. He may have contracted malaria, but within months, her infant son and her husband died. So she went back to teaching. And there was an ad posted by the American Anti-Slavery Society, which is also known as the American Missionary Association. They worked with Quaker churches. So she answered the call, and then she was sent to Texas. And that was her first post as a teacher in a freedmen's school. It was a really hostile environment. Teachers there had difficulty getting paid. The Ku Klux Klan were constantly threatening teachers in the schools. So eventually she came to Athens, Tennessee. And it was in Athens where she encountered a student by the name of William Henry Richards. And Richards was the son of emancipated slaves. He was orphaned at age 4 and raised by his grandmother. So he attended Freedmen's School in Athens. He was an excellent student. Nelson really had a fondness for him because he was very poor. He didn't have family. So she basically, sponsored a lot of his education, and they came here to the Warner Institute to teach. And he actually was a student at the Warner Institute and taught in Greenville and in Johnson City. The Warner Institute was basically a one-room school. There was boarding on site. It was also a church and a community center. They taught chemistry, they taught German, they taught Latin, high school classes, elementary classes. They had exhibitions, and Julia Nelson, in her letters to her family, spoke of how hospitable Jonesborough was to freedmen, and teachers spoke of how crowded those events would be because of public interest. When Richards finished school at Warner Institute, he went on to Howard University. From Howard University, he became acquainted with several Black philosophers, lawyers, sociologists at the time who were writing public essays about the indifference to Black rights and the amendments to several state constitutions that were revoking rights that were promised to emancipated or freedmen or African Americans after Reconstruction. So they found that there was a need, a resource for African Americans so that they could understand their legal rights, because times were kind of getting turbulent again. The Niagara movement was named for the other side of the Niagara in Canada, which is where meetings took place because hotels there weren't segregated. The Niagara movement was funded by philanthropists, including Andrew Carnegie, but there were some issues with funding, and that movement fell out. DuBois, of course, went on to establish the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. So Julia Nelson wanted to take a leave from the Warner Institute in 1881. She had had a pretty strong track record there with teaching, and she was kind of getting weary from issues with funding and political events, suffrage. So she was taking this break, and then the abolitionist Frederick Douglass wrote her a letter asking her to go back to Jonesborough, and she did, and she stayed there until 1888. So basically, the Underground Railroad, education for freedmen, and then later, a very central resource and a prominent figure in the civil rights movement of the 1950s, 1960s. All of that comes together in Jonesborough at the Warner Institute. That's kind of a hidden treasure. Thank you for watching. I hope you find our little history snippets interesting, and we'll have more for you next month.